Hi, welcome back to CS170 fall session. We're just completed with hourly exam number one. I know there were some questions about that. Um, I guess you could also look at the fact that this is a, you know, exam that falls under the second chance policy. So if you didn't do as well as you would have liked, uh, either because you felt like the exam was too fast or you didn't have the pacing right or whatever. Um, you know, you look at this as sort of like a first run at it, and then you'll get a second shot at getting a better grade on this with the second chance policy, where you take the final exam, and if the part one score of the final exam is better than your exam one score, then your final grade will be taken from the best of those two. If you did better on the first exam, fine. If you did better on the part one of the final exam, then that will be your grade for exam one. Okay. Um, and then I kind of noticed that there was a couple of students that have issues with submitting things in HTML, whether it's like they're used to working with one editor or another editor, or they're using the online HTML tools and stuff like that. But you do actually have to save the files into a working HTML file. Um, the online tools is like a quick and dirty way of like, checking if your individual snippet of HTML works or not. But you can't really use that as a proper HTML file, to run on your server and render the page, right? It's only looking at snippets of the HTML code. So if you don't know how to, put in all the elements necessary to create a .html file, make sure you let us know, right? Your TAs can go over that with you during lab hours or whatnot. Because your upcoming assignments in JavaScript will also need you to submit the files in HTML, okay? So keep that in mind. So the other thing I've kind of gone back and forth with a couple of times, and apologies on that. I know we've seen some dates flip-flopping on assignment 4. So I've been looking at this part here, where you can see it was due October 1st, and then it became October 8th for the accept until date, which happens to be inconsistent with what the due dates have been set to on Canvas. So it's a long story as to why there was so much flip-flopping on the dates. But ultimately, it's been shifted 1 week for everything on assignment 4. So this due date became October 8th, and then the accept until date became October 15th, which pretty much overlaps with assignment 5. Okay, so that's what it is. I know it's not consistent with this fall student schedule, because this is the way it was supposed to be, and then it got changed later on. Okay, so apologies for the confusion on chapter 4 assignment. Okay, and not chapter 4 assignment number 4. Okay, but anyway, so here we are. We're going to be talking about JavaScript functions this week. Okay, and then the recitation is going to go over more of like the event-driven programming, which is what we covered last week in that example for the lecture. So they'll basically go into more details during recitation this week for event-driven programming, JavaScript. Okay, so we'll step over to here. And oh, and by the way, I think a lot of people did a pretty good job with the extra credit from last week. I like the assignment, the extra credit, where people kind of mixed it up a little bit. They changed the function to work a little bit differently, changed the colors, added some new choices on the radio buttons and stuff like that. So, I think that's pretty good exercise in terms of exercising the functionality that you need to know for JavaScript. So that's a good job. And I think I'm going to continue and do something similar like that for this week also. And I'll set that up for the lecture after this one. Okay. All right. So what are functions? In a way, you've actually already used functions already. If you remember when you looked at when something is a number and you did like the two fixed so that you can set it to be two decimal places, you're basically using a function, okay? So here's kind of more of the formal definition of what a function is, okay? And it actually kind of applies for functions for most programming languages. But, it mentions this in terms of JavaScript, which is what you're working with. So a JavaScript function is a basically a block of code that should be designed to perform one particular task. Okay, it doesn't always do that, right? This is kind of sort of an aspirational goal of what a JavaScript function should be doing. I've seen other implementations for one reason or another, but I think for the purpose of this class, you can look at it as saying it's a block of code that does one particular task. Okay. So they kind of draw an analogy here to making pizza. So you have a couple different steps here. One is making the dough, one is making the sauce, and one is making the pizza. Okay. So these are kind of discrete steps or things that you can wrap up into a function. And what that means is that if you're writing this, and let's say in your recipe or whatever, you're making multiple different types of pizza, right? But how you might make the dough will be the same no matter how many times you make that pizza. So instead of typing that code over and over again, you're just going to create a function called make dough and then call that function. So you don't have to type that over and over again. And then later on, if you decide that you actually do want to make a change in how you make the dough, you only have to make that change once. And then it will apply for everyone that wants to use those same set of steps in a function. Okay, so that's really the reason why you have this idea of functions here. Okay, and what I just explained here is basically these 3 bullet points here, right? So the first part, which we just talked about, doing one particular task. The other one, it simplifies the programming. So like I said, instead of doing the same bits of code over and over again, many different times, you only write the code once, and then other people can refer to that function code. Just like I was saying with the numbers, where you can do like the two fixed, hundreds and thousands of programs could be using that function, and they don't have to re-implement that code. They just have to call that function. Okay, so that's what they mean here. Functions allow for reuse of code. Okay, so just like in when you declare a variable, you have this idea of declaring the function, right? So we're talking about creating a function here. And so how do you do that? Well, first you have to say you're going to create a function. So you start with this word, you say function, and then you give it a name. And it's kind of sort of camel case here, right? So you have to convert, and then you have the capital C, and then you have a 2 and an F here. Okay, so it's kind of along the lines of camel case, right? And then they did the same thing here with the parameters, right? And this is also in camel case. So parameters means like basically the input, right? So in this case, we're declaring a function that is converting Celsius to Fahrenheit. So you want the input to be the temperature in Celsius, right? So that's what this parameter is. It's basically creating a variable to store the temperature in Celsius, okay? Here's another function declaration. They're declaring a function to do a coin flip. Now for a coin flip, you don't actually have to have an input to that. It's not like where you're converting the Celsius to Fahrenheit, where you input it in Celsius. The coin flip doesn't need any input at all. You just flip the coin. Okay, so that's why it's a blank here for the parameter. Okay, this one on this function, they basically flipped it around. Now you're converting from Fahrenheit to Celsius, and now the input would be a temperature in Fahrenheit. Okay, and then they have another function here called BMI, where it's taking input. In this case, they're saying I'm taking in the weight in pounds and then the height in inches here. So this continues on with in terms of creating a function. Before you basically, this was the first line just to kind of say there's such a function and this is the name and this is the input for it. Now you continue on with this idea of creating a function. So you already did this part up here. Now you're going to have this part here, which is the actual calculation. So here, you remember we declared the variable, and then you're actually initializing it all in one line, right? So declaration, the name is result, and then this is the actual calculation, right? So it's taking, these are just regular numbers here, multiply it by your input, right? Your input is your temperature in Celsius, and then add 32, right? Now you've done all the calculation, you stored the result into this variable called result. Now you're going to return this to whoever called this function, right? So you're going to do a return and then result, okay? And then they basically did a very similar function. Now it's going the other way. Now you're converting from Fahrenheit to Celsius. So now you have a function, you declare it, function is F to C, and then you're going to do the input as the temperature in Fahrenheit. And then same thing here, I'm going to declare the variable degrees C, and I'm going to say this calculation here, which is taking the Fahrenheit and doing the minus 32 and 5/9. And then I store the result into degrees C, and then I'm going to return the degrees C here, degrees Celsius, okay? You have here, you have like some parameter naming conventions. It's basically the same as the variable. So you kind of almost use it interchangeably in terms of the, the rules that you follow, right? So good practice, it's consistent with that. So you can kind of go back and refer to what were the things that you had to follow when you were naming a variable. You're going to have to do the same thing when you look at naming for the naming convention for a function. Okay. So there's like a comment here talking about the variables. So the normal variables is like what you've been already using. All right, and then the parameters, which is essentially a variable, right? But there's like some difference in terms of what we refer to as scoping, what we call as variable scoping. Okay, so when you declare, let's say in this case, the temperature in Celsius, okay, very important here is that it can only be used inside the function, right? And from a computer science standpoint, they refer to it as being local to the function, okay? And then this is a tricky bit, which is actually a bad idea, right? But you have variables with the same name can be used in different functions, okay? And in some sense, you can't really avoid it, because if you have like a whole bunch of functions that you're using and other people are writing other programs that are using functions, then you're bound to have, some of this, right? But if you put it all into one place, you have like many different functions and you're kind of working on it. It can get a little bit confusing, right? So if you happen to have a bug somewhere, or you have like a syntax error or whatever, and it's attributed to maybe storing an incorrect value into a variable. And if you've been using the name of this variable like all over the place in many different functions, it's like a nightmare to kind of figure out what's wrong, okay? I mean, there are ways to do it, especially if you have a good debugger and stuff like that. But it is a pain. The fact that you can use the variable with the same name in different areas of the code, and they're actually very different, right? So it's only within the context of that function, let's say, all right? And so what does that mean, right? So that means, and maybe later on when I do a little bit of a code snippet, I'll show this to you. What does that mean? So now I declare this temperature in Celsius, and you can see within the code, they refer to temperature in Celsius, like right in here. But let's say that we also created this function F to C, Fahrenheit to Celsius. If I were to take this variable and refer to it in here, it wouldn't work, right? It will tell you like, I don't know what this variable is, right? And I just said variable and parameters interchangeably, which essentially it kind of is, but like I said, there is a slight difference. And so you have to understand that. If I use this temp in LC, this variable or parameter only exists within this function, okay? Now, the other bit where I was saying that you can actually use the same name, if I came in here and I actually somehow I took temp in LC and I did a var temp in LC here, it would have the same name, right? But it essentially means something different, right? Like you can see here, I declared var degrees C. What happens if I just took this, put this here? Okay, and of course I have to change that too, if I did that, okay? Looks like the same variable to me, but actually from a computer perspective, it's not the same. There are two different memory locations, essentially. So that's something you have to watch out for, right? So if someone says, oh yeah, there's a bug and you're storing like a string into the temp in else in C, then you kind of say, where do I do that, right? It could be in this function or it could be in this function. So that's why it's a little bit tricky, but something to be mindful of, okay? So two things remember with these parameters. It's essentially a variable, but it's only existing within the lifetime of you doing something within this function, okay? And I can use that same variable name or parameter name in another function, okay? And it won't be the same thing, right? So make sure you're mindful of this. It's good programming habit, and it will help you, just like what I mentioned in the last lecture, or one of the older lectures about doing your nesting of like your if else. It can get very confusing if you try to implement it all at once. So you implement it little by little. So these are the type of things that you should try to pay attention to. Otherwise, it's going to make your homework assignment very difficult to debug. Okay. All right. So pay attention to those points. Okay. So we talked about this already, right? So you already had at this point here where we actually had the working, the guts of this inside these curly brackets here. Okay. So that's what this is talking about here. Okay. And then, the typical stuff in terms of like doing like the semicolons and whatnot for your JavaScript that we talked about in the last lecture. Okay. But once you're done with everything, this is important. The return of the value here. Okay. Now, there are times where you actually can call a function and you don't have to return anything. It just does whatever it is that you want to do. But generally, you call a function and it can return some value back, right? Because you want to control the data and how it's presented, and you may use it to do other calculations. So by you calling a function and having it return some data back to you to do something, it gives you more flexibility and more control, right? If I call a function and that function within that function already has like a display, whatever, display the results of your calculation, and it doesn't return anything back to you, it limits the flexibility and control that you have. So it's pretty much good practice for you to return the value from a function. So that's why you have this return and then whatever this is, right? This could be a calculation, or it could just be a variable that you already did the calculation, right? So in this case, we declared the variable result, and then we return whatever is inside the result. Okay. All right. So I hope that makes sense to you. So making the call, all right. So you just kind of call it, right? So you have the function within your code, and you would just say, in this case, convert C to F, and then it will be like, let's say you pass in this argument, right? Argument is the value that you pass into your function, and it's in this case it's 38, right? So I could do something like this, right? Remember the alert box, right? I can do the alert box, and then within that I can say what is the result that comes back from converting Celsius to Fahrenheit with the input of 38, let's say. Okay, so that's how you would call a function. Okay, alternatively, I could just say a variable, right? I can say var, Celsius result equals to convert C to F, right? So something like this, or Celsius, something like that, right? So that's how you would call a function, get the output from the function, and store the result into whatever you want. Or like I said before, you can do an alert box also. Okay, like I said before, you can have something like a coin flip that doesn't need an argument at all. Okay, you can pass in multiple parameters like that. Okay, in this case, you're adding two numbers together. Okay. Okay, so parameters, you think of it as like saying these are the inputs. So remember like your flow chart, and even like when you convert your flow chart into your pseudocode. So the one that we did like the Facebook login or something like that, right? You took in the login and you took in like the password, right? So in a similar manner, when you have a function, like let's say that Celsius to Fahrenheit example, well, you kind of need like a Celsius temperature for you to do anything. How do you know what you're going to convert if you don't have the input of the Celsius, right? So that's basically what they're talking about when they say parameters, right? That's the input that you need to calculate whatever. In this case, Celsius to Fahrenheit, let's say. Okay, and this is just again re-articulating like the similarities and differences between a function and a standard variable. Okay. Not say not function, a parameter and a standard variable. I don't know why I said function. Yeah. So here's another example, multiple inputs here. And then you have them multiplied together, right? So you calculate your hours worked times your rate of pay. Okay. Some more in terms of arguments and parameters, right? Here's the function, you declared it, and then you convert, and then you have your input parameter there. Okay. And again, multiple parameters that you can pass in. Okay. So this just kind of illustrates a little bit where here's like where you have your main function calculation, and you want to call something else like the function to do something. Okay. So your main program, you kind of keep it like a simple flow here, and then you kind of have more details about the calculation within the function. Okay. So within here, it does a call, and then you do your function calculation, and then it will return a value and comes back to here. Okay, so that's what they mean by like your flow, right? So you're calling a function, it does something, and it comes back to the main program, the main part of the program here. Okay, so this is an example where it doesn't return a value, right? And like I said, it just kind of displays like this here. Okay, so within the function, you can see it does the alert here. Okay, so this means every time like someone calls this function, they don't control whether it's going to display something or not. It's always going to display this alert here. Okay, and this is what I was saying before. I would prefer that you would take the value here, return it back to your main program, and then you can choose to do the display, or you can choose to take the result and do something else with it. Right, and this is the case where it does the return, right? So here it doesn't return, it has the alert. Here it does the return with the calculation, and then you can print it out if you want. So you can do something like that. Okay, so these are just some more examples of functions here. Okay, and just a couple of different points about it being declared. You only declare a function once. You're not going to declare it multiple times. That's one of the benefits of a function. And then you can call a function many times, right? That's how you get reuse out of it. Right, this part goes into like scoping and whatnot. So I think I'm going to stop the lecture here and then continue on with this in a separate lecture. And I'll also include the extra credit into the subsequent lecture here. So I'm going to pick this as a stopping point for this lecture.